When Solon, born around 640 BC in archaic Greece, set out to save Athens, the city was in a deep crisis. Solon's contemporaries must have understood this. They also seem to have understood Solon's importance, which still shines through today due to the comparatively rich sources concerning his person. The city-state of Attica was by far the largest in the Greek world, stretching around 2,500 square kilometers. Argos, second in place, had just 1,400. About the same size as Attica, Boeotia was spread over 10 polis. And Crete, considerably more extensive, is said to have contained over 100 municipalities. Only Sparta, the later archenemy of Athens, could rival Attica in size. Including the occupied lands of Messenia, and individual Syracusan colonies, no less than 8,000 square kilometers, lay within her sphere of influence. This, necessarily, resulted in a very different way of organizing the state in this kingdom than in the much smaller city-states, such as Athens. Possibly even a different conception of personal freedom. The approach to social issues, and the rigidity of social norms. Around the year 500 BC, probably about 200,000 people were living in Attica, about a fifth of whom constituted the citizenry. Argos had about 15,000 citizens, Corinth 10,000. Attica, measured in lift lines, lies almost at the center of the Greek world. In terms of importance, it was less central in Solon's time. Politically insignificant. Not involved in the power games of the Peloponnese. Known to well-traveled merchants, at most, from passage on the strait between Evia and the mainland, which was popular because of its calm seas, and running alongside the Attic east coast. Usually, Athens was not even known as a transfer point, nor as a producer, or buyer, of valued goods. The crisis Athens faced around 600 BC, was not one of the city, but represented the culmination of developments in the whole of archaic Greece. A changing spirit, perhaps due to the repercussions of founding colonies, and sending excess populace there, gripped the Greek cities. The sheer vastness of the newly inhabited lands, had to have a broadening effect on people's minds. All the new possibilities, the proximity to the ancient and splendid kingdoms of the East, not least, to the Persian Empire. And the possible luxury, that had been revealed. Quite a few Attic farmers were thus tempted to focus on olives for export, instead of working for the domestic market. It took at least 10 years before the first olives may be harvested. Many had to get into heavy debt, not only because of such projects. Farms, even whole families, had to be mortgaged to the aristocracy, who held all the money, lands and laws. Similar situations could be found in every corner of the Greek world. Those in need were not always prepared to accept these injustices. Bloody fights broke out, sometimes to the extent of civil wars. Often enough, these fights were incited by nobles, who placed themselves at the head of these popular movements, to claim power, or to try to do so. Attica's situation was therefore not unusual per se. The problems, however, only came to light a little later than in other city-states. Maybe due to Athens' relative reclusiveness compared to the other great municipalities around her. The Athenians thus had a chance to learn from the mistakes of other polis. When the discontent in Attica threatened to turn into open anger, Solon, the son of Exixtides and descendant of a noble family, stepped up. He tried to show his fellow citizens that there were not only single parts of the current social and economic order in disarray. They as a whole lived in a total state of disorder, a so-called dysnomia. And he warned them that they were heading for a catastrophe that only they, as a citizenry, could prevent together. With his future powers he would not, as had so often been the case, take responsibility away from his fellow citizens, but he bore it together with them. He was not only concerned with balancing divergent interests. It was about creating a just order for the community as a whole. It must also have been seen as the gods' will to bring such an order. But they were, that much was clear, not the ones to create it. How he might have convinced the Athenians that he was the right man to restore a just order, to be the bringer of rebalance as it was called at the time, is not certain. Later, when criticized for his decisions, he insisted that he had explained to the Athenians what he intended to do in detail, and in advance. But convince them he did, as he was elected archon, probably in 594 and 93 BC, and was vested with the extraordinary powers necessary to fulfill his unique role. Solon's reforms, intended to lead the city out of this imminent crisis, cut deeply into the oh-so-familiar fabric of Attic society. He issued a complete debt cut, presumably for the so-called hectomorias, who either had to hand over 1/6 of their yields as repayment of their debts, or who were allowed to keep 1/6 of their income. That much is uncertain. He also lifted all mortgages on farms. It seems, some of Solon's contemporaries accused him of having informed his friends before the debt cut, so they could take out large loans, and acquire land without paying for it. We do not know whether this is true, but it does not seem likely, at least if it was clear to everyone, that the cut would come at some point during his administration. Following this legislation, almost all creditors lost the totality of their loans. The Attic peasants were restored to their former status before the debt crisis. Debt bondage was also permanently eradicated from Athens by prohibiting access to the person of an insolvent by law. Henceforth, only property could be mortgaged away, which, of course, could also consist of non-Athenian enslaved people. He also freed all Athenians who had been enslaved due to debt bondage, and even bought back those who had already been sold abroad. The necessary funds must have been confiscated from the aristocracy. A general amnesty exonerated debtors who had evaded the obligation to pay by fleeing the city. Only those convicted of striving for tyranny were not allowed to return home. All this is a sign for the comparably firm position the peasantry must have had. Not only were they the ones who had to do the manual labor of the land, without which the economy would implode, but it was also the fact that the simple farms and houses provided soldiers for the militias, who also had to be able to arm themselves as hoplites. Apart from this military aspect, Solon suspected the people could not have been kept calm in another way. The debt cut, he was sure, was necessary to prevent civil war and Athens' inevitable ruin. Any order seeking to suppress or dominate such free and responsible peasants had to be considered wrong and unjust by the people. But Solon was not a revolutionary. He did not intend to let the people lead, and the nobility be abolished. In his eyes, the foundations of the political order had to remain in place. Of course, this did not rule out all changes in general. For example, the linking of the application for public offices to a census, instead of the affiliation to a specific family, was introduced, even if it remains unclear whether this ultimately affected the circle of those admitted in any significant way. Likewise, the census composition was changed. The original three classes, the Hippies, representing knights, the Zeugites, the general peasantry, and the Thetes, small farmers and day laborers, were joined by a fourth. The Pentakosiomedeimnoi, Greek for 500 bushels, were singled out of the first class and represented all who had more than 500 bushels yield of grain or oil. Knights had to show at least 300 bushels. Zeugites 200, and Thetes 100 bushels. It is unknown how tradesmen or craftsmen fit into this. Solon also created the Council of the 400 to provide representation for members of broader classes, and established a people's court for certain cases. He further forbade the export of all foodstuffs except olives, limited personal land acquisition, and tried to attract craftsmen and artisans to the city, by promising them the otherwise unattainable Attic citizenship. In addition, all parents who did not have enough land to bequeath to their children were required to let them learn a trade. Those who did not do so, lost the right to be maintained by their descendants in old age by law. Weights and measures may also have been rearranged. He also codified all laws being now in force. He introduced the popular complaint, which enabled anyone to bring charges in many matters, except homicide and murder, which were reserved to relatives of the deceased. All these laws were too extensive for the wooden tablets on which they were written to be able to be attached to a single building, as was usually the case. So they were mounted on vertical trolley axles, axons, most probably placed under some kind of roof. Every citizen had to take an oath on the new laws, some of which remained valid for a long time, and formed the basis of every later declared Attic law. Whether the ordinary Athenians were actually interested in them at the time, is questionable. For them, everything seems to have revolved around the debt reform. Sysacthia, as it was called. The shaking off of burdens. Solon's overall moderation got him caught in the crossfire of criticism. The rich had not believed he had been serious, and thought his announcements were merely a pretext to gain power. They had assumed he would let them be, once he had obtained it. Others thought he did not go far enough, and should have confiscated the entirety of Attican soil to be redistributed equally amongst the citizenry. These clamors were also connected to constant offers and requests towards Solon, to keep the power over Athens. The idea was, that such a comprehensive land reform could not be implemented and maintained in the long term, any other way than by tyranny. None of these offers fell on fertile ground. Solon found, that the peasants got, thanks to him, more than they had ever dared dream of before he took office, without spilling a single ounce of blood. Many of the later accusations against him, were also not so much based on the opinion, that he was not willing to sacrifice himself for the city, but rather lamented the blatant stupidity, that must have been necessary in the eyes of his contemporaries, to not tighten the net in Solon's hands, into which the gods had already led the simple-minded Athenians. But the extraordinary powers he was endowed with, seemed to Solon only a temporary solution on the way to the just order. Tyranny, even as a means to an end, as it may even have served in the short term, was never seriously considered by Solon as a long-term solution. In his later justification, he wrote he had covered both sides in this conflict with his shield, and protected them, had stood on the battlefield as a boundary stone between the parties, and had to defend himself like a wolf, encircled by dogs. Solon found himself in a quandary. The power of the nobility, its unseemly insatiability, had to be limited. The city could not be abandoned to their greed, lest it was to go into ruin. But it was equally clear to him, that the nobility had to lead. Alone by right of virtue of their education and material means. And he must have thought that once the just order was restored, they would automatically, structurally necessarily, lead justly again, which was probably a miscalculation. The immediate success of his reforms was limited. He would probably have achieved more in the short term as a tyrant. Indirectly, however, the effects of Solon's reforms continued to ripple through future Greek times. They also formed the mental basis for gaining distance to the status quo, and raising awareness that it is not, as it often seems to be, automatically the desirable or even the just state, but merely the currently prevailing one. And this was something new. Solon's reforms and ideas showed that change was always an option. Possibly a desirable, and in Athens' case, a necessary one, if the community was to be maintained. In this sense, Solon was perhaps the first, whom we can understand as a citizen in the broadest sense, as we know the term today. These advancements might also have been a first seed in the collective memory of Athens, that bore the strength necessary, first to recognize the alternative to the traditional, and then to take it on. which later proved so crucial in the Persian Wars or the episode at Salamis. This strength through ingenuity made it possible for Athens, not only to endure these brutal wars against the superpower of their time, but to rise to become the mistress of almost the entire Aegean. Even if Solon's legislation cannot be dated with absolute certainty, it was probably followed by a period of new noble disputes, and then the tyranny of Pisistratos. However, these battles probably did not go so far as to paralyze the city as a whole, for shortly before the tyranny, the great festival of Athena, the Panathenae, was instituted, and likely the first temple to the goddess built on the Acropolis. It seems, great efforts in the name of the city were still possible, even during these struggles. Whatever his fellow citizens might have thought of Solon, their opinions could, for the time being, leave him unaffected. In order not to be forced to implement his laws further, or even to interpret them himself, he decided to take a decade-long educational trip, after completing his work as bringer of rebalance. A self-chosen exile for the hero of Athens, but certainly a serene and earned one.